The Politics of Reality, Essays in Feminist Theory by Marilyn Frye. Essay 9, the last essay. To Be and Be Seen, The Politics of Reality. Note: this is a very slightly revised version of the essay which appeared in Sinister Wisdom 17 with the title To Be and Be Seen, Metaphysical Misogyny. End of note. Part 1. In the spring of 1978, at a meeting of the Midwestern Division of the Society for Women in Philosophy, Sarah Hoagland read a paper entitled, quote-unquote, Lesbian Epistemology, in which she sketched the following picture. Quote, in the conceptual schemes of phallocracies, there is no category of woman-identified women, woman-loving women, or woman-centered women. That is, there is no such thing as a lesbian. This puts a lesbian in the interesting and peculiar position of being something that doesn't exist, and this position is a singular vantage point with respect to the reality which does include her. It affords her a certain freedom from constraints of the conceptual system. It gives her access to knowledge which is inaccessible to those whose existence is countenanced by the system. Lesbians can therefore undertake kinds of criticisms and description and kinds of intellectual invention hitherto unimagined. End quote. Hoagland was urging lesbian feminists to begin this work, and she did not try to say in advance what could be seen from that exceptional epistemic position. Some critics of that paper, bridling at the suggestion that lesbians might be blessed with any exotic powers or special opportunities, were quick to demand a definition of the word quote-unquote lesbian. They knew that if a definition of lesbian featured certain patterns of physical contacts as definitive, then the claim that phallocentric conceptual schemes do not include lesbians would be obviously false, since phallocrats obviously can and do wrap their rapacious minds around verbal and visual images of females so positioned physically with respect to each other. And they knew also, on the other hand, that any definition which is more quote-unquote spiritual, such as women-identified women, will be flexible enough to permit almost any woman to count herself a lesbian and claim for herself these existing epistemological privileges. Other critics who found Hoagland's picture engaging but were loath to glorify the conditions of exile pressed for a definition of lesbian which would be both accurate and illuminating, a definition which would shed light on what it means to say lesbians are excluded from phallocratic conceptual schemes, and which might even provide some clues as to why lesbians might see from this, what lesbians might see from this strange non-location beyond the pale. These pressures, combined with the philosopher's constitutional propensity to view all orderly procedures as beginning with definitions, and the assembly was irresistibly drawn into trying to define the term lesbian. But to no avail. The term is extraordinarily resistant to standard procedures of semantic analysis. It finally dawned on me that the elusiveness of the meaning of the term was itself a clue that Hoagland's picture was right. If indeed lesbians' existence is not countenanced by the dominant conceptual scheme, it would follow that we could not construct a definition of the term lesbian of the sort that might recommend a well-intentioned editors of dictionaries. That we might recommend to well-intentioned editors of dictionaries. If a conceptual scheme excludes something, the standard vocabulary of those whose scheme it is will not be adequate to the to the defining of a term which denotes it. If Hoagland's picture is right, then whatever we eventually do by the way of defining the word quote-unquote lesbian, that definition will evolve within a larger enterprise and cannot be the beginning of understanding and assessing that picture. Another way of beginning is suggested by the observation that women of all stripes and colors, including lesbians but also including non-lesbians, suffer from erasure. This is true, but it also seems to me that Hoagland is right. The exclusion of lesbians from phallocratic reality is different and is related to unusual knowing. The difficulty lies in trying to say just what this means. In order to get a handle on what we need to explore the differences and the connections between the erasure of women generally and the erasure of lesbians. This inquiry about what is not encompassed by the conceptual scheme presents problems which arise because the scheme is in question is, at least in the large, the inquirer's own scheme. The resources for the inquiry are, in the main, drawn from the very scheme whose limits we are already looking beyond in order to conceive the project. This undertaking, therefore, engages me in a sort of flirtation with meaninglessness, dancing around about a region of cognitive gaps and negative semantic spaces, kept aloft only by the rhythm and momentum of my own motion, trying to plumb abysses which are generally agreed not to exist and to map the tensions which create them. The danger is of falling into incoherence, but conceptual schemes have saving complexities such that their structures and substructures imitate and reflect each other, and one thus can locate holes and gaps indirectly which cannot, in the nature of the thing, be directly named. I start with a semantic reminder. Part 2. Reality is that which is. The English word quote unquote real stems from a word which means regal, of or pertaining to the king. Real is in Spanish means royal. Real property is that which is proper to the king. Real estate is that of the king. Reality is that which pertains to the one in power, that is, over which he has power in his domain, his estate is proper to him. The ideal king reigns over everything as far as the eye can see, his eye. What he cannot see is not royal, not real. He sees what is proper to him. To be real is to be visible to the king. The king is in his counting house. Part 3. I say, quote, I am a lesbian. The king does not count lesbians. Lesbians are not real. There is no lesbian. End quote. To say this, I use the word lesbian, and hence one might think that there is a word for such a thing, and thus that the thing must have a place in the conceptual scheme. But this is not so. Let me take you on a guided tour of a few standard dictionaries to display some reasons for saying that lesbians are not named in the lexicon of the King's English. If you look up the word lesbian in the Oxford English Dictionary, you find an entry that says it is an adjective that means of or pertaining to the island of Lesbos, and an entry describing at length the favorably an implement called lesbian rule, which is a flexible measuring device used by carpenters. Period. Webster's Third International offers a more pertinent definition. It tells us that a lesbian is a homosexual female, and going on, one finds that quote unquote homosexual means of or pertaining to the same sex. The elucidating example provided is the phrase quote unquote homosexual twins, which means same sex twins. The alert scholar can conclude that lesbian is a same sex female. A recent edition of Webster's Collegiate Dictionary tells us that a lesbian is a woman who has sex or sexual relations with other women. Such a definition would be accepted by many speakers of the language and at least seem to be coherent, even if too narrow. But the appearance is deceptive, for this account collapses into nonsense too. The key word in this definition is quote unquote sex, or having a sexual relations. But what is having sex? It is worthwhile to follow this up because the pertinent dictionary entries obscure an important point about the logic of sex. Getting clear about that point helps one see that there is semantic closure against recognition of the existence of lesbians, and it also prepares the way for understanding the connection between the place of women and the place of lesbian with respect to the phallocratic scheme of things. Dictionaries generally agree that quote unquote sexual means something on the order of pertaining to the genital union of a female and a male animal, and that quote unquote having sex is having intercourse, intercourse being defined as the penetration of a vagina by a penis with ejaculation. My own observation of usage leads me to think that these accounts are inadequate and misleading. Some uses of these terms do fit this dictionary account. For instance, parents and counselors already standardly remind young women that if they're going to be sexually active, they must deal responsibly with the possibility of becoming pregnant. In this context, the word quote unquote sexually is pretty clearly being used in a way that accords it with the given definition. But many activities and even and events fall under the rubric quote unquote sexual, apparently without semantic deviance, though they do not involve penile penetration of the vagina of a female human being. Penile penetration of almost anything, especially if it is accompanied by ejaculation, counts as having sex or being sexual. Moreover, events which cannot plausibly be seen as pertaining to penile erection, penetration, or ejaculation will, in general, not be counted as sexual, and events that do not involve penile penetration or ejaculation will not be counted as having sex. For instance, if a girl child is fondled and abused by a man and comes to orgasm, but the man refrains from penetrating and ejaculating, the man can say, and speakers of English will generally agree, that he did not have sex with her. No matter what is going on, or it must be mentioned, not going on, with respect to the female arousal or orgasm, or in connection with the vagina, a pair can be said without semantic deviance to have had sex and not to have had sex. The use of the term turns entirely on what was going on with respect to the penis. When one first considers the dictionary definitions of sex and sexual, it seems that all sexuality is heterosexuality by definition, and the term quote unquote homosexual would be internally contradictory. There are uses of the term according to which this is exactly so, but in the usual and standard use, there is nothing semantically odd in describing two men as having sex with each other. According to that usage, any situation in which one or more penises are present is one in which something could happen which could be called having sex. But on this apparently quote unquote broader definition, there is nothing women could do in the absence of men that could, without semantic oddity, be called quote unquote having sex. Speaking of women who have sex with other women is like speaking of ducks who engage in arm wrestling. When the dictionary defines lesbians as women who have sex or sexual relations with other women, it defines lesbians as logically impossible. Looking for other words in the lexicon which might denote these beings which are non-named quote unquote lesbians, one thinks of terms in the vernacular like dyke, bulldagger, and so on. Perhaps it is just as well that standard dictionaries do not pretend to provide relevant definitions of such terms. Generally, these two terms are used to denote women who are perceived as imitating, dressing up like, or trying to be men. Whatever the extent of the class of women who are perceived to do such things, it is obviously not coexistent with the class of lesbians. Nearly every feminist, and many other women as well, have been perceived as wishing to be men, and a great deal many lesbians are not so perceived. The term dyke has been appropriated by some lesbians as a term of pride and solidarity, but in that use it is unintelligible to most speakers of English. One of the current definitions of quote unquote lesbianism among lesbians is woman loving, the polar opposite of misogyny. Several dictionaries I checked have entries for quote unquote misogyny, hatred of women, but not for phylogeny, love of women. I found one which defines phylogeny, a fondness for women, and another dictionary defines phylogeny, Don Juanism. Obviously, neither of these means love of women, as it is intended by lesbians, combining the vocabulary for ways to refer to themselves. According to the dictionaries, there is no term in English for the polar opposite of misogyny, nor for persons whose characteristic orientation towards women is the polar opposite of misogyny. Flinging the net wider, one can look up the more Victorian words like sapphism and sapphist. In Webster's Collegiate, sapphism is defined just as lesbianism, but the Oxford English Dictionary introduces another twist. Under the heading of Sapphism is an entry for Sapphist, according to which Saphists are those addicted to unnatural sexual relations between women. The fact that these relations are characterized as unnatural is revealing. For what is unnatural is contrary to the laws of nature or contrary to the nature of the substance of entity in question. But what is contrary to the laws of nature cannot happen. That, it, that is what it means to call the of nature laws of nature. Sorry. And I cannot do what is contrary to my nature, for if I could do it, it would be my nature to do it. To call something quote unquote unnatural is to say it cannot be. This definition defies Saphists, that is, lesbians, defines Saphists, that is, lesbians, as naturally impossible as well as logically impossible. The notion that lesbianism is not possible in nature that is that it is nobody's nature to be a lesbian, has a life of its own even among some people who do know factually that there are certainly women who do and are inclined to do certain things that other women and who sincerely avow certain with other women and who sincerely avow certain feelings and attitudes towards women. Lesbianism can be seen as not natural if that is if someone lives as a lesbian. It is not assumed that it is just who or how she is. Rather, it is presumed to be some sort of affliction, or it is a result of a failed attempts to solve some sort of problem or resolve some sort of conflict. And if she could find another way, she would take it and then would not be a lesbian. Being a lesbian is understood as something which could be nobody's natural configuration, but must be a configuration one is twisted into by some sort of force which is in some basic sense external to one. Quote unquote being a lesbian is understood here as certain sorts of people understand quote unquote being a delinquent or quote unquote being an alcoholic. It is not of one's nature the way illness is not of one's nature. To see these to see this sense of quote unquote unnatural, one can contrast it with the presumed quote unquote naturalness of heterosexuality of women. As most people see it, being heterosexual is just being. It is not interpreted. It is not understood as a consequence of anything. It is not viewed as possibly a solution for some problem or a way of acting and feeling which one worked out or was pushed to by circumstances. On this sort of view, all women are heterosexual, and some women somehow come to act otherwise. On this view, no one is, in the same sense, a lesbian. There are people who do believe in the real existence of perverts and deviants. What they share with those who do not is the view that the behaviors and attitudes in question are not natural to humans. One's choice, then, when confronted with someone who says she is a lesbian, is to believe her and class her as not fully or really human, or to class her as fully and really human but not believe that she is a lesbian. Lesbian. One of the people of the Isle of Lesbos. It is bizarre that when I try to name myself and explain myself, my native tongue provides me with a word that is so foreign, so false, so hopelessly inappropriate. Why am I referred to by a term which means one of the people of Lesbos? The use of the word lesbian to name us is a quadrufold evasion, a laminated euphemism. To name us, one goes by way of a reference to the island of Lesbos, which in turn is an indirect reference to the poet Sappho, who used to live there, they say, which in turn is itself in direct reference to what fragments of her poetry have survived a few millennia of patriarchy, and this in turn, if we have not lost you by now, is a prophylactic avoidance of direct mention of the sort of creature who would write such a poem or to whom such poems be written. Assuming you happen to know what it is in these poems, written in a dialectic of Greek over 2,500 years ago and on some small island somewhere in the wine dark Aegean Sea. This is truly a remarkable feat of silence. The philosopher John Langshaw Austin, commenting on the connection between language and the conceptions of reality, said the following quote, our common stock of words embodies all the distinctions men have found worth drawing, and the connections they have found worth making in the lifetimes of many generations. End quote. Our common stock of words men have found. Distinction is not worth drawing, connection is not worth making. Revealing as this is, it still dissembles. It is not that connections and distinctions are not worth drawing and marking. It is that men do not want to draw and mark them, or do not dare to. Part 4. When one says that something or some class is not countenanced by a certain conceptual scheme, or that it is not, quote, among the values over which the variables of the system range, end quote, or that it is not among the ontological commitments of the system, there are at least three things this can mean. One is just that there is no simple direct term in this system for the thing or class, and no very satisfactory way of explaining it. For example, It is in this sense that Western conceptual schemes do not countenance the forces or arrangements called quote unquote karma. Indeed, I don't know whether it is suitable to say quote unquote forces or arrangements here, and that is part of the point. A second thing that can be meant when it is said that something is not in the scope of the concepts of the scheme is that the term which ostensibly denotes the thing is internally self contradictory, as is the case of round squares. Nothing can be in both the class denoted by round and the class denoted by square, given what those words mean. A third thing one can mean when one says a scheme does not encompass a certain thing that is according to principles which are fundamental to the most general picture of how things are in the world. The thing could not exist in nature. An example of this is the denial that there could be a beast which was a cross between a dog and a cat. The belief that such a thing could exist would be inconsistent with the belief about the nature of the world and of animals, which underlie vast chunks of the rest of our lives. The rest of our worldview. Lesbian is the only class I have ever set out to define, the only concept I have ever set out to explain, that seemed to be shut out in more than one of these ways. As the considerations reviewed here seem to show, it is shut out in all three. You can quote unquote not believe in lesbians, as you don't believe in the possibility of quote unquote doggy cats, or as you don't believe in round squares. Or you can be just unable to accommodate lesbianism in the way that I cannot accommodate the notion of karma. It doesn't articulate suitably with the rest of my concepts. It can't be worked into my active conceptual repertoire. The redundancy of the devices of closure, which are in place here, is one of the things which leads me to say that lesbians are excluded from the scheme. The overdetermination, the metaphysical overkill, signals a manipulation, a scurrying to erase, to divert the eye, the attention, the mind. Where there is a manipulation, there is motivation. And it does not seem plausible to me that the reason lies with the physical details of a certain woman's private lives. The meaning of this erasure, and of the totality and conclusiveness of it, has to do, I think, with the maintenance of phallocratic reality as a whole, and with the situation of women generally apropos that reality. Part 5. At the outset, I said lesbians are not real, that there are no lesbians. I want to also say that women in general are not countenanced by the phallocratic scheme, are not real. There are no women. But the predicament of women apropos the dominant reality is complex and paradoxical, as is revealed in the women's mundane experience of the seesaw of demand and neglect, of being romanced and assaulted, of being courted and being ignored. The observations which lead me to say there are no women in phallocratic reality themselves also begin to reveal the elements of the paradox. These observations are familiar to feminists. They are among the things we come back to again and again as new layers of their meanings become accessible to our understanding. There are two kinds of erasure of women which have by now become quote unquote often noted. One is the conception of human history as a history of the acts of, and organizations of men, and the other is a long and sordid record in Western civilization of the murder and mutilation of women. Both of these erasures are extended into the future, the one in fiction and speculation, the other in the technological projects of sperm selection for increasing the population of male babies, of extrauterine gestation, of cloning, of male to female transsexual reconstruction. Both sorts of erasure seem entwined in the pitched religious and political battle between males who want centralized male control of female reproductive functions and males who want individualized male control of female reproductive functions. I speak of the fights about abortion, forced sterilization, the conditions of birthing, etc. A reasonable person might think that these efforts to erase women reveal an all too vivid recognition that they are women, that the projects of ideological and material elimination of women presuppose belief in the existence of the objects to be eliminated. In a way, I agree. But also, There is a peculiar mode of relating belief and action, which I think is characteristic of the construction of phallocratic reality, according to which a project of annihilation can be seen to presuppose the non existence of the objects being eliminated. This mode is an insane reversal of the reasonable procedures of adjusting one's views so that they accord with reality as actively discovered. It is a mode according to which one begins with a firmly held view, composed from fabulous images of oneself, and adopts as one's project the alteration of the world to bring it into accord with that view. A powerful example of this strange practice was brought to my attention by Harriet Des Moines, who had been reading about the United States expansion across the North American continent. It seems that the white men, upon encountering the vast and rich mid-continental prairie, called the prairie a desert. They conceived a desert, they took it to be a desert, and a century later it is a desert, a fact which is presently somewhat obscured by the annual use of megatons of chemical fertilizers. Did they really believe what they were seeing was a desert? It is a matter of record that that is what they said they saw. There is another example of this sort of practice to be found in the scientific and medical realm, which was brought to my attention by the work of Aileen Van Tassel. It is the standard assumption of the disciplines of human biology and human medicine that the species consists of two sexes, male and female. Concrete physical evidence that there are individuals of indeterminate sex, that quote unquote sex characteristics occur in spectrums and not as all or nothing phenomenon is not acknowledged as existent evidence, but is removed, erased through chemical and surgical quote unquote cures and quote unquote corrections. In this case, as is the case of the rich and living prairie, erasure of the fact and destruction of concrete objects does not demonstrate recognition of the fact or object. It is, on the contrary, direct manifestation of the belief that those are not the facts and the belief that no such individual objects exist. If it is true that this mode of connection of belief and action is characteristic of phallocratic culture, then one can construct or reconstruct beliefs which are fundamental to that culture's conception/scientific system by inspecting the culture's projects and reasoning that what is believed is what the projects would make to be true. As noted before, there are and have long been ongoing projects whose end will be a world with no women in it. Reasoning back, one can conclude that those whose projects these are believe there are no women. For many of us, the idea that there are no women, that we do not exist, began to dawn when we first grasped the point of the non generic so called quote unquote generic man. The word woman was supposed to mean female of the species, but the name of the species is man. The term female man has a tension of logical impossibility about it that is absent from parallel terms like female cat or female terrier. It makes one suspect that the concept of the species which is operative here is one according to which there are no females of the species. I think one can begin to get a handle on what this means by seeing how it meshes with another interesting phenomenon, namely the remarkable fact that so many men from so many stations in life have so often declared that women are unintelligible to men. Reading or hearing the speeches of men on the unintelligibility of women, I imagine the men are like people who for some reason can see everything but automobiles and are constantly and painfully perplexed by blasts and roars, thumps and bumps, which they cannot avoid, control, or explain. But it is not quite like that, for such men do seem to recognize our physical existence, or at least the existence of some of our parts. What they do not see is our souls. The phallocratic schemes do not admit women as authors of perception, as seers. Men understands his own perceptions as simultaneously generating and being generated by a point of view. Men is understood to author names. Men have a certain status as points of intellectual and perceptual origin. Insofar as phallocratic schemes permit Insofar as the phallocratic scheme permits the understanding that women perceive at all, it features women's perceptions as passive, repetitive of men's perception, non-authoritative. Non-authoritative. Aristotle said it outright. Women are rational, but do not have authority. Imagine two people looking at a statue, one from the front, the other from the back. And imagine that the one in the front thinks that the one in the back must be seeing exactly what he is seeing. He cannot fathom how the other came up with a description so different from his own. It is as though women are assumed to be robots hooked up to the senses of men, not using senses of our own, not authoring perception, not having and generating a point of view. And then they cannot fathom how we must be wired inside, that we could produce the output we produce from the input they assume to be identical to with their own. The hypotheses that we are seeing from a different point of view, and hence simply seeing something he cannot see, is not available to men. It is not in his repertoire, so long as his total conception of the situation includes a conception of women as not authoritative perceivers like himself, that is, so long as he does not count women as men. And no wonder such a man finds women incomprehensible. Part 6. For the reasons given, and in the ways indicated, I think there is much truth in the claim that the phallocratic scheme does not include women. But while women are erased in history and in speculation, physically liquidated in genocidal purges, and banished from the community of those with perceptual and semantic authority, we are, on the other hand, regularly and systematically invited, seduced, cajoled, coerced, and even paid to be in intimate and constant association with men and their projects. In this, the situation of women generally is radically different from the situation of lesbians. Lesbians are not invited to join the family, the party, the project, the procession, the war effort. There is a place for women in every game: wife, secretary, servant, prostitute, daughter, assistant, babysitter, mistress, seamstress, proofreader, nurse, confidant, masseuse, indexer, typist, mother. Any of these is a place for a woman, and women are encouraged to fill them. None of these is a place for a lesbian. The exclusion of women from the phallocratic scheme is impressive, frightening, and often fatal, but it is not simple and absolute. Women's existence is both absolutely necessary to and sorry, irresolvably problematic for the dominant reality and those committed to it, for our existence is presupposed by phallocratic reality, but it is not and cannot be encompassed by or countenanced by that reality. Women's existence is a background against which phallocratic reality is a foreground. A foreground scene is created by the mention of foreground figures against a static background. Foreground figures are perceptible, are defined, have identity, only in virtue of their movements against a background. The space in which the motion of foreground figures takes place is created and defined by their movement with respect to each other and against the background. The space in which the motion of the foreground figures takes place is created and defined by their movement with respect to each other and against the background, but nothing of the background is in, or is part of, or is encompassed by the foreground scene and space. The background is unseen by the eye, which is focused on the foreground figures, and if anything somewhat draws the eye to the background, the foreground dissolves. What would draw the eye to the background would be any sudden and well defined motion in the background. Hence, there must be either no motion at all in the background, or an unchained buzz of small, regular, repetitive motions. The background must be utterly uneventful if the foreground is to continue to hang together, that is, if it is to endure as a space within which there are discrete objects in relation to each other. I imagine phallocratic reality to be the space and figures and motion which constitute the foreground, and the constant repetitive uneventful activities of women to constitute and maintain the background against which this foreground plays. It is essential to the maintenance of the foreground reality that nothing within it refer in any way to anything in the background, and yet it depends absolutely upon the existence of the background. It is useful to carry this metaphor on in a more concrete mode, thinking of phallocratic reality as a dramatic production on a stage. The motions of the actors against the stage settings and backdrop constitute and maintain the existence and identities of the characters in the play. The stage settings, props, lights, and so forth are created, provided, maintained, and occasionally reared rearranged according to the script by stagehands. The stagehands, their motions and the products of those motions are neither in nor part of the play, and neither in nor part of the reality of the characters. The reality in the framework of which Hamlet's actions have their meaning would be rent or shattered if anything Hamlet did or thought referred in any way to the stagehands or their activities, or if the background blur of activity were in any other way to be resolved into attention catching events. The situation of the actors is desperately paradoxical. The actors are absolutely committed to the maintenance of the characters and the characters' reality. Participation as characters in the ongoing creation of the reality is their raison d'etre. The reality of the character must be lived with fierce concentration. The actor must be immersed in the play and undistracted by any thought for the scenery, props, and stagehands, lest the continuity of the characters and the integrity of the reality be dissolved or broken. But if the character must be so lively, sorry, but if the character must be lived so intently, who will supervise the stagehands to make sure they don't get rowdy, leave early, fall asleep, or walk off the job? Alas, there is no god nor heavenly host to serve as director and stage managers. Those with the most intense commitment to the maintenance of the reality of the play are precisely those whose interested in the proper deportment of the stagehands, and and this interest competes directly with that commitment. There is nothing the actor would like better than that there be no such thing as stagehands, posing as they do a constant threat to the very existence, the very life of the characters, and hence the meaning of the life of the actor. And yet, the actor is irrevocably tied to the stagehands by his commitment to the play. Hamlet, of course, has no such problems. There are no stagehands in that play. To escape his dilemma, the actor may throw caution to the wind and lose himself in the character, whereupon stagehands are unthinkable, hence unproblematic. Or he may construct and embrace the belief that stagehands share exactly his own perceptions and interests, and that they are committed to the play as he, that they are like robots. On such a hypothesis, he can assume them to be absolutely dependable and go on about his business single mindedly and without existential anxiety. A third strategy, which is in a macabre way more sane, is that of trying to solve the problem technologically by constructing actual robots to serve as stagehands. Given the primacy of his commitment to the play, all solutions must involve one form or another of annihilation of the stagehands. Yet all three require the existence of stagehands. The third, he would hope, requiring it only for a while longer. The solution to the actor's problem, which will appear most benign with respect to the stagehands because it erases the erasure, is that of training, persuading, and seducing the stagehands into loving the actors and taking actors' interests and commitments onto themselves as their own. One significant advantage to this solution is that the actors can carry on without the guilt or confusion that might come with annihilating, replacing, or falsely forgetting the stagehands. As it turns out, of course, even this is a less than perfect solution. Stagehands, in the thrall of their commitment, can become confused and think of themselves as actors, and then they may disturb the play by trying to enter it as characters, by trying to participate in the creation and maintenance of reality. But there are various well known ways to handle these intrusions, and this seems to be, generally speaking, the most popular solution to the actor's dilemma. Part 6. All eyes, all attention, all attachment must be focused on the play, which is phallocratic reality. Any notice of the stagehands must be oblique and filtered through interest in the play. Anything which threatens the fixation of attention on the play threatens a cataclysmic dissolution of reality into chaos. Even the thought of the possibility of a distraction is a distraction. It is necessary to devise devices and construct systems which will lock out the thought crime of conceiving the possibility of a direct and attentive focus on anything but reality. The ever present potential for cosmological disaster lies with the background. There is nothing in the nature of the background that disposes it to be appropriately tame. It is not made to serve the foreground, it is just there. It therefore is part of the vocation of the phallocratic loyalists to police attention. They must make it radically impossible to attend to anything in the background. They must make it impossible to think it possible to fasten one's eyes on anything in the background. We can deduce from this understanding of their motivation what it is that phallocratic loyalists are motivated to forbid conceiving. What must not be conceived is a seer for whom the background is eventful, dramatic, compelling, whose attention fastens upon stagehands and their actions. The loyalists cannot just identify such seers and kill them, for that would focus the loyalists' own attention on the criminal, hence the crime, hence the object of the crime, and that would interrupt the loyalists' own attention to reality. The king is in his counting house. The king is greedy and will count for himself everything he dares to. But his greed itself imposes limits on what he dares to count. Part 7. What the king cannot count is a seer whose perception passes the plane of the foreground reality and focuses upon the background. A seer whose eye is attracted to the ones working as stagehands, the women. A seer in whose eye the woman has authority, has interests of her own, is not a robot. A seer who has no motive for wanting there to be no women. A seer who is not loyal to reality. We can take the account of the seer who must be unthinkable if reality is to be kept afloat as the beginning of the account of what a lesbian is. One might try saying that a lesbian is one who, by virtue of her focus, her attention, her attachment, is disloyal to phallocratic reality. She is not committed to its maintenance and the maintenance of those who maintain it, and worse, her mode of disloyalty threatens its utter dissolution in the mere flick of an eye. This sounds extreme, of course, perhaps even hysterical, but listening carefully to the rhetoric of the fanatical fringe of the phallocratic loyalists, one hears that they do think that feminists, who they fairly reasonably judge to be lesbians, have the power to bring down civilization, to dissolve the social order as we know it, to cause the demise of the species by our mere existence. Even the fanatics do not really believe that a lone maverick lesbian can, in a flick of her evil eye, atomize civilization, of course. Given the collective given the collectivity of conceptual schemes, the way they rest on agreement, a maverick perceiver does not have the power to bring one tumbling down. A point also verified by my own experience as a not so powerful maverick. What the loyalists fear, and in this I think they are more or less right, is a contagion of the maverick perception to the point where the agreement is in perception which keeps reality afloat begins to disintegrate. The event of becoming a lesbian is a reorientation of attention in a kind of ontological conversion. It is characterized by a feeling of a world dissolving and by a feeling of disengagement and re engagement of one's power as a perceiver. That such conversion happens signals its possibility to others. Heterosexuality for women is not simply a matter of sexual preference, any more than lesbianism it is. It is a matter of orientation of attention, as is lesbianism, in a metaphysical context controlled by neither heterosexual nor lesbian women. Attention is a kind of passion. When one's attention is on something, one is present in a particular way with respect to to that thing. This presence is, among other things, an element of erotic presence. The orientation of one's attention is also what fixes and directs the application of one's physical and emotional work. If the lesbian sees the woman may see the lesbian seeing her. With this, there is a flowering of possibilities. The woman, feeling herself seen, may learn that she can be seen. She may also be able to know what a woman can see, that is, can author perception. With this, there enters for the woman the logical possibility of assuming her authority as a perceiver and of shifting her own attention. With that, there is the dawn of choice, and it opens out over the whole world of women. The lesbian seeing undercuts the mechanism by which the production and constant reproduction of heterosexuality for women has to be rendered automatic. The existence of lesbians is a piece in the mechanism which is supposed to cut off the possibility of choice or alternative at the root, namely, at the point of conception. The maintenance of phallocratic reality requires that the attention of women to be focused on men and men's projects, the play, and that attention not be focused on women, the stagehands. Women loving, as a spontaneous and habitual orientation of attention is then, both directly and indirectly, inimical to the maintenance of that reality. And therein lies the reason for the thoroughness of the ontological closure against lesbians, the power of those closed out, and perhaps the key to the liberation of women from oppression in a male dominated culture. Part 9. My primary goal here has not been to state and prove some rigid thesis, but simply to say something clearly enough, intelligibly enough, so that it can be understood and thought about. Lesbians are outside the conceptual scheme, and this is something done, not just the way things are. One can begin to see that lesbians are excluded by the scheme, and that is motivated when one begins to see that what purpose the exclusion might serve in connection with keeping women generally in their metaphysical place. It is also true that lesbians are in a position to see things that cannot be seen from within the system. The lesbian sees it, the lesbians see it. What lesbians see is what makes them lesbians, and their seeing it, why they have to be excluded. Lesbians are women seers. When one is suspected of seeing women only, one is spat summarily out of reality through the cognitive gap and into the negative semantic space. If you ask what became of such a woman, you may be told she became a lesbian, and if you try to find out what a lesbian is, you will be told there is no such thing. But there is. We finished the book, Heinz.